This is a production of Cornell University.
So I spent time in Australia, and then in about 2000 went overseas, joined the international set, and then went back to Australia in 2016. Now I'm back in Colombia. So I've been around a lot. So the title here, and I'm a specialist in precision agriculture and what you might call on-farm experimentation and digital agriculture. But I've been around a lot, and I've seen a lot of demand for actually getting change from research in agriculture. So this talk is going to be a real mishmash. There'll be some things that you're very familiar with. There'll be some things that you probably don't like. There are going to be some things that may be new to you. But hopefully what I want to do is just try and forge a picture of change and how we can, as researchers, we can get change and why it's so important in agriculture. So here we are, titled Delivering Agricultural Research to Farmers. Well, is that going to go? Oh, there we go. Very fancy. I didn't do that. I didn't do that. That was Microsoft. So delivering agricultural research to farmers should actually be delivering agricultural research not just to, but also with farmers. In actual fact, seeing farmers not just as recipients of research and of science, but actual co-innovators. It's not easy, but I think it's worth trying. And it's not the only thing for science to do, but I think it's something that we've kind of ignored and need to develop a little bit more. So the outline, a little bit small there, sorry about that, but what I'll do, first of all, I'll just paint a picture of the demand for science and research. I'll then talk not just about production, because we tend to focus quite a lot on production, but I want to switch just emphasis a little bit to food systems, because that's where we are these days. And then I just want to spend a few minutes talking about how do you know, or what do you think science really does? How do you actually get change in the system, and how do you know that it's actually occurred? So I'll talk a little bit about the theory of change. I'll then spend a little bit of time talking about the value, who actually gets the value from research, because we hardly ever think about that. And actually, it's a very under-researched topic. And I'll just finish off with a bit of stuff that I really like doing, the on-farm experimentation, as an example of putting farmers in the center of change. Okay, so that's the outline. If you want, you can go to sleep for part of it and then wake up for a bit of it, or maybe stay awake for the first part and then doze off later. You okay? It's okay. That's fine. So let's think a bit about the growing demands for ag research. I'm not from a farm. I will be, get my own farm, but I'm not from a farm or farming background. But even I can see that it's really important globally, agricultural research to support change. Here we have the obvious one to start with is population growth. Population growth in North America, still growing through 2050, reaching a plateau about 2100. Think about Europe. Europe is already passing its peak growth phase. Put these two together, you've still got very moderate growth. Of course, if you think about Latin America, that's still in its standard growth phase, should flatten out in the next few decades. Compare that tiny compared to the growth of population throughout Asia, particularly in India, but not just India, and still growing and not due to peak for another couple of decades. Now that's worrying enough, heading us towards 9+ billion people. But here's the really scary one for me, is that the growth of population in Africa projected to increase through to 2100 and increase further still. In fact, we'll only reach the global peak in about 2080. So there's still a lot more people heading our way, and the impacts are going to be massive. What are the impacts on food demand? Well, here's a graphic from the FAO. You'll all have read those reports, you know, effectively a doubling of demand for food production and protein throughout the world. What's it going to mean in terms of the demand for land? This is the business as usual, another 100 million hectares, pretty serious. If we get it right, if we get agriculture really right, then there's some hope that we'll reduce the demand for further extensification of agricultural land by intensification and other smart agriculture to actually end up just a little bit more. But that's not happening just yet. If we have this third scenario, which is called the stratified, they call it the stratified societies scenario, but it basically means that no effort is put into correcting inequalities throughout the world. The FAO project, in actual fact, that if we don't fix that, this is going to be the demand for agricultural land, arable land anyway, through to 2050. Massive increase, much more than we can sustain. This shaded area here is the projections of how much land will be lost through degradation, through not taking care. So huge demand for improvement in efficiencies of agricultural systems and in terms of investment in agricultural landscape. Really major. Where's the food going to come from? Well, I just threw these in just out of amusement, basically. These are the figures from FAO for food export for wheat, millions of tons. This is North America. Okay, you've had your good years and your bad years, but generally it's a slight upward trend, but more or less stable. This is Eastern Europe. So in other words, you've got new entries into the global food market. This is for wheat. Similar story for corn or maize, where you've got two new entries actually overtaking. This is Eastern Europe again. Okay, this is, I guess, the Ukraine effect there. But in actual fact, Latin America, Argentina, and Brazil are going great guns to export more corn throughout the world. Similar story for soy. Here we have growth of soy exports from North America increasing, but those from, particularly from Brazil, increasing even more rapidly. So there's going to be change in production systems globally to meet massive growth in demand. Production isn't the only thing that we need to worry about. Here we have a graph of greenhouse gas emissions from meat-based systems. Two worrying trends here, huge growth of greenhouse gases emission from meat-based systems in Africa and Brazil. Some places have actually got slightly better. China is one. Big problem there, greenhouse gas management. Similar true for crops. You can have these graphs if you like. Rice is obviously the one that people are worried about, but large growth in greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 equivalents throughout the world. A major concern. Another concern, food waste. Something like 20–30% of food is actually wasted throughout the food system. This figure here, your country and mine, Australia and North America. 1,520 calories lost or wasted per person per day. Huge losses within the system. Major concern for the World Bank. So getting on top of that. And another problem facing agricultural research is the protection of natural capital. Interesting to see McKinsey produced this report last year about getting companies on board to try and correct the erosion of natural capital globally. So my point is, it's not just production anymore. There are a number of different issues, major issues facing agriculture, facing agricultural research. So you all know all this, but there's a switch to thinking towards food systems. Food system thinking offers a much wider scope for opportunities for research and change. And now I'm about to show you this diagram, horrendously complex, but it's the best one I could find. And it portrays very well the complexity of the food system. Just to make this a little bit easier to think about, you can think about 5 domains. This is where the business really starts, the production domain. Now, this has occupied a lot of our thinking for many years, how to produce more food, how to produce more stuff. But in actual fact, when you take a food system thinking, there are other domains that are equally important. In actual fact, I got tuned into this when I looked into digital agriculture, trying to understand what was happening in digital agriculture. The investments in digital agriculture, there are more investments in digital agriculture in this end of the system than there are in this end of the system. So to them, these are the bit that's growing, the consumer side of things. So it's not just about producing more stuff and doing it better, but it's also learning what consumers want and need and tuning the system towards their needs a little bit more. There's a lot of attention also going into processes, improving these complex food supply chains that actually get you from a ton of maize through to the final product that people pay a lot for. Two more domains to think about. One is the capitals. So thinking about how can you protect and nurture human and environmental capital on which the whole system depends. We tend to ignore that, but that's really important and increasingly important throughout the world. And the fifth one is how you're going to govern the whole system. How you're going to manage finance, how you're going to manage regulation to actually keep the system working effectively and keeping these demands in balance. So there's a lot of thought gone into food system thinking. And I think it opens many different avenues for agricultural research. Now, here's the thing. In reality, how does research actually deliver change? Well, there's one concept here that I actually quite like. A lot of people in the CG don't like this. They think, well, we've done a lot of good work developing new germplasm. We don't need to worry too much about how our change is actually occurring. I think there's a big difference. If you're actually producing new germplasm, you're producing a wonderful seed, you can throw that seed into a system, and there's a reasonable chance, if it's the right thing, that people will work out how to use it. If you're actually looking about how the system itself is being managed, that's a lot more complex issue. And you have to think, or they have to think, people have to think a lot harder about how the change is actually occurring. And we tend not to do that. We're so fixated on doing the work, writing up the papers, publishing the papers, going on to the next paper, that there's no reward in most research systems for actually thinking about the actual change on the ground. And this was something that I really liked when I first went to Australia. The CEO of the National Research Organization came out and he said, look, you know, I'm not really interested how many papers you've published this year. He said, you've got to publish the papers because that's how you learn your science. But I don't really care how many you've done. What I need you to do is I need you to tell me what science have you developed to enable change that I can report to politicians and get the politicians off my back. So for me, that was a revelation because coming from the UK, which was a highly academic system, and there was a huge disconnect between research and real outcomes, to go to a system where research was being rewarded for its science, providing it delivers some kind of change. That was quite important. So again, I think the theory of change is quite a helpful concept. If you think about your research, could you actually do the theory of change? Could you actually specify what is the explicit or testable model of how and why change that you're supporting is actually going to happen? Can you do that? Honestly, it's not easy. And it can sometimes be quite challenging. And of course, your change may not be directly with farmers. You might be helping somebody else who's going to be helping farmers. You're an important part of the chain, but still, you're in part of what's called an impact pathway, which is an important concept. The theory of change also needs to identify the context and the key actors in the system. So who actually are you talking to? Who are you hoping to change? What are their behaviors that you're expecting to change? And have you really thought about it, or whether you're delivering what's going to enable them to change? And then think about the causal pathways a little bit that can contribute to those outcomes and impacts. Now, not everybody in this room needs to worry about all of these, but you're part of a change process, and it's good just to recognize what part you play. So here you have a theory of change diagram. You know, you thought my diagrams were terrible. This is even worse, but it puts all of the things together. This is what we tend to focus on as researchers: activities And if you're lucky, we'll think a bit about the outputs, what we're producing, where are our results, where are our papers or reports. But the process actually goes through towards an outcome, which is basically a behavioral change. Somebody's going to do something differently that they couldn't have done if you hadn't delivered that output. What is that? And how is it actually going to happen? Now, here they talk about these things, spheres of control, spheres of influence, and spheres of interest. You can only control this part of the change process, but you're assuming and you're understanding, and because you talk to people who you hope are going to use your research, you're going to help deliver these in the sphere of influence. And over the longer term, produce these bigger term impacts that you think are really, really important. And actually just going through this process is very important, very helpful too, because it actually helps you sharpen your activities and outputs to actually achieve these goals. Okay, I don't want to spend too much longer on that because it's kind of bureaucratic, but I think it's helpful. And if I was a young researcher, I would really like to have learned a little bit about that, so that even if I focused on my bit, I could see where it led towards the bigger picture. Okay. Now here's a bit of weird stuff here, is that the value of the change drives research, but who actually gets the value? Often we make assumptions about this. And I got into this because when I looked at digital agriculture, it was pretty clear that there was a lot of work and a lot of activities going on in digital agriculture, but farmers didn't get it. They didn't like it. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal, Harold, you might have seen this one, it was a couple of years back, about the disappointment of big data in agriculture and about disappointment of digital agriculture. Basically, everybody's still trying to figure out where the value in data is. This was a farmer speaking, and it was a feature in the Wall Street Journal. And the reason this came up is because agriculture, here we had a graphic of the different sectors of the US economy, and don't worry, the Australians were just as bad. This was the level of digitization within the sector. Agriculture, bottom of the class, basically. So the question is, why is that actually occurring? And it seems to be the problem is that the value isn't being delivered to farmers. Now, how to explain that? Now, this isn't the prettiest of diagrams, but I hope it gets somewhere. The best I found to try and help explain this was from a series of work in the UK by an economist called Pavitt, and he identified how technology was used in industries in the UK, and he came up with this 4-class model that explained where the value was created and, more importantly, where it was kept. He had these 4 classes, and here these flashes are supposed to be value. Don't worry, I'll explain these hopefully in a second. Let's take this one, because this one is the one that we're probably most familiar with. This is, I think he called it the public R&D model, whereby governments invest in the research. They do that because they're expecting that you will produce brilliant research outputs that have some public good. They don't mind you actually working for Syngenta or somebody else, providing you do it at arm's length, because they're saying we want to use taxpayers' money to try and develop things that has a general public good. Now, what you might find, a mixture of innovation hubs to try and help this process move along. And in agriculture, traditionally, what we've tried to do is rely on extension processes to get from here down to here, these farmer groups, okay? So the value is created here, and it's actually shared and often promulgated by publication processes to actually try and spread the word. Yeah, that's good. Now, the next model relies on private R&D. John Deere, Syngenta, Bayer, they have big research budgets, good operators. They're not going to publish their or spread their intellectual property any further than they have to. So they try to tend to keep it because that's where they're getting their value from. They have a product that they want to sell to farmers or others. They want to sell the next product. They want to get more value out of the next product, out of their R&D by providing something that is considered to be worth a little bit more. So they keep the IP, they keep the value in-house, different to the one before. They actually try and keep that in-house. And quite often, they'll protect that quite fiercely. And if you see where the investment is going in digital ag, you'll find a lot of it is actually going into this kind of thing, whereby a service or a product is actually being delivered to farmers, farmers buy it, a lot of the value stays with the producer. The third type is what you might call scale sensitive. It's not a great word, but what it means is that the value is generated at different parts of a supply chain or a value chain. Economists can't work out whether they prefer that. Now you can think about this. There are large integrated organizations within the food system. Remember the food system diagram? There are some large organizations within that they don't want disruptive innovation. They want cumulative innovation. They see their position within the system as being quite powerful and dominant, and they want to try and hold that within their organizations as much as they can. So they will protect that IP as well. They'll have closed doors. They won't willingly share all of that. They'll expect that to be within their own system. So you can think of the large agribusiness organizations that actually use technology, learn and keep it that way. But farmers, in these cases, at best are seen as suppliers of product and might get rewarded for it, or they might not, but they're not getting value. So that leaves us with the last type of model, which is what's called supplier dominated, not a great word, but basically this is the one I would say is missing somewhat. And so what I'd like to think of, and like I'd try and see, is actually improving the value generation within this class of business model in which farmers learn by doing much more, but also increase the value that they can generate through networking and through technology adoption. So obviously that is going to rely also on these, so the interaction between these, and particularly from you guys, how do you actually get the processes through to that so that they can start generating their value for themselves near to hand? That's where we come on to on-farm experimentation. And I'll just spend just a few minutes on this, in which we see, as probably you do, farmers as co-innovators, not receivers of innovation, but actually co-innovators. Okay. Now, when you say the word experimentation, it raises all kinds of things in research institutes such as this one. So you can think about what is an experiment. And often we use experiments to explore theories. But I would say there are different types of experiments and different types of experimental thinking. One is around epistemic theory driven, which tends to have a semantic focus. That means that you're interested in the meaning that the results represent to you. And to do that, you need to have the theory. And these are scientist implemented because that's what we do. That's what we learn as scientists. But there's another type of experiment, which is action guiding theory. It's much more pragmatic. If you talk to a farmer about the results of an experiment that they put in, they're less interested in actually why it occurred. They do want to know why it occurred, but they're less interested in why it occurred than the fact that it did occur and that it means something to them in that system. You could say that they're sort of characterized by, I don't really care why it did it. I just know it does it every year and I want to fix it. So that's much stronger action. It's much more pragmatic action and it's user implemented. Now, what I'd say is that in agriculture, we actually might have taken a wrong turning because experimentation was the core of agricultural development for a long time. But in the 1920s, Sir Ronald he came out with this fantastic analysis of variance, mathematically elegant thinking, and the learning at that time definitely switched strongly to specialists. Then we moved into sort of a style of working with a lot of germplasm research, and then precision ag came along, but it was driven from here, or the corn belt anyway, and learning and IP tended to be distanced somewhat from farmers. Farmers, again, were pushed into the position of being buyers of intellectual products and services that were developed by others. So what we're trying to do with the OFE here, farmer-centric OFE, is actually trying to shift the emphasis back to farmers. So this is what it looks like. You've got two different types of change processes here. We've got the exogenous one that we've tended to use for a long time. You're aiming for certain generalizable results. You don't really know too much about the relevance because we tend not to ask. We don't know about the adoption rate and are often disappointed that there should be more, but it hasn't happened. And it generally has a low data content because the experiment is where the data was generated. When you put it out, you don't tend to follow up. The endogenous approach, we want to see farmer-centric. Farmers come up with the questions. The results are often highly variable in our experience. They're often highly variable and quite uncertain, but they're extremely relevant on site. And they're easily adopted because they're framed by the farmer and they're interpreted with the farmer in ways that they can use, and they tend to create a lot of data. Now, here's one that we started with. This picture, it's a terrible picture. I'd actually lost track of it completely, but this was the first of our large on-farm experimentations. It was in the bloody 90s, right? It was 30 years ago almost, and it was done almost by accident. We had a farmer's boy who was brilliant at the technology, and he actually developed the first variable rate technology in Australia to produce this checkerboard test. And we thought this was just fantastic. The farmer loved it. Agronomists hated it because when we analyzed the results of this experiment, and it was our first experiment, 72 hectares, right? We found that there were many different sources of variation. We had set this out as a nitrogen trial, but in actual fact, there were weeds there was wetness, there was drought, all in the same area. There was potassium deficiency over one part, and another part, the trace element deficiency. We said to the farmer, sorry, Doug, this is impossible. How can we make sense of this? There's just too many things going on. In actual fact, nitrogen, even though we'd plastered it with soil samples and had a really good agronomist working with us, we still were unable to explain much more than about 30% of the area, the response over 30% of the area. And the farm said, well, welcome to my world. This is what I have to deal with every paddock, every year. It's uncertain. And this information, even though it covers only part of the area, it's still useful to me. I find it useful. And I believe it because it's on my land. Anyway, we thought this was great. But in actual fact, it wasn't the first of farmer-centric attempts. But a lot of work had been going on in the 80s and 90s. Larry Harrington, he was here. Do you remember Larry? He did a lot of this earlier work with CIMMYT and CIAT, Jackie Ashby. They did a lot of participatory research, but they didn't have the data that we have now. And they didn't have the processes, and they weren't able to capture the value put back into the system. So that's what we're aiming for. So anyway, we got onto this, and we did all sorts of weird stuff. Oops, sorry. It's gone. We had strips, replicated strips, blocks, donut, checkers, all sorts of experimental design. The farmers liked all of them. In many cases, the agronomist found it very difficult to work with because the results were too big, too uncertain. So what's the basic process? Well, the first one is you need organization. You need to organize farms. You can't do it one-to-one. You've got to look for organizing entities. In our area, it was farmer groups, or it could have been a supplier. These sort of things, the organization is key. Farmers do the inquiry. They start looking to see what happens if I do this. the specialist support, let me help you with this stuff. And then the farmers and specialists together interpret the results, and then they continue inquiry. Very simple process. As I said, we had lots of different types of designs. This was actually one of our earliest ones. We were very proud of that, but nobody else liked it. Checkerboard and strips. Farmers do these in Australia. I know here they do a lot of these standard. This was actually the largest one we did, was 6,000 hectares, but that was in oil palm. They just wanted to know what was going on. The enriched strip or the strip trials, those are very commonly used experiments, quite large. And the important thing about that is that we see it as a continuous, what we call a racetrack process of engagement, data capture, analysis, interpretation, and then use. So there's a mixture of technical and social processes going on here. We have some basic rules that we applied. We found them useful. The first was obviously keep it farmer-centric. This was one that the farmer more or less put in without help. He just wanted to do it himself. Keep it simple. Keep the experimental structure simple, because the landscape is big and it will get complex. So keep the experimental design as simple as you possibly can. Keep it big. Two reasons for that. One is that you want to use, as far as possible, commercial machinery. You want the farmer to be able to install the experiment without thinking too much about it. It's got to be concordant with their ways of managing it. The other reason is that farmers understand and manage their land according to landscape clues and signals. They understood, for example, that this bit of dirt down here produced these results for that reason, and that this was quite different up there. In other words, they like it big because it helps them interpret it and apply it to management. Keep out of the way. There are times when farmers don't want to talk to you. There are times when they're too busy. So there are certain times where we had this rule, keep out of the way, make it easy, and keep exploring. Okay, so those were basic ideas. So how do you actually get value from the process? Well, here we have a number of kind of quotes about what are the sort of things that they found. And there are a number of characteristics about the way that farmers said they found these results helpful. One of them is that it was pretty clear what worked to them and what didn't, what was important. The cumulative one is when it helps them learn much more about their system and they become more certain to the point at which they can make those critical management change. And the other one is that sharing can be important, that actually a collective use of insight can be really important. Okay, just a couple of minutes to go. How do you actually scale up the whole process? Well, I don't know how many of you might be familiar with this, but we used the business model canvas idea to actually couple the idea. Basically, what the business model canvas approach does, and we might think we're proud if we get a few hundred or even 1,000 citations. This has actually got over 22,000, I think. So it's a very widely used in the business world concept of basically putting the whole package together. Concentrate on these two bits. First is, what's the basic idea? How are you going to offer a new service, or what are you going to produce that's going to help people, and who actually will you benefit? Is it going to be farmers? Is it going to be certain types of farmers? Is it going to be consultants, maybe suppliers? If you haven't worked out that, then you can't work out what this whole business model is doing. If you can work that out, then you can actually develop a business model that can be scaled up. And then, so the final part of this OFE story is actually networking. Now, Janice, you'd recognize some of these places, probably with horror, but there we go. So, but this was just our first attempt at this after doing that, but there was instantly a network of people who are interested in trying to develop this, and that's really important from a scaling up point of view, because you can't be talking to individual farmers. You need to actually scale out the business model for impact. So in summary, what have I been talking about? First of all, hopefully I made it pretty clear that agriculture has to get more active, and there are still some really major problems facing us. And research, it's really a good time to be in agricultural research, I think. There's an awful lot to do. But I do think it's valuable and important to think a bit, not just about production, but think about the food systems and think about the places within the food system you might like the research you're doing to actually impact and change things. I would say farmers are often not the only or even the most common developers of research insight as currently done. And they are not often the recipients of value according to those 4 business models. There hasn't been that value generated with farmers for them. They tend to be treated or assumed to be as customers or clients of valuable IP generated from elsewhere. I think Cornell might be somewhat different in that it still, and it always had, an extension mindset of government-funded change, but still good to focus on how the value is going to be generated and how farmers are going to get it. And so what I'm saying and what I'm working on personally and with Louis is actually farmer-centric co-innovation with networking to develop this value-based IP with farmers and actually networking up. And I'd say here there's a huge new role for researchers, but it's not just agronomy. You've actually got to have some social sciences in there, and you'll have the data sciences too. And that's very rare to find in any university, combination of agricultural sciences, social sciences, and data sciences. But there's going to be a mix of those in there to actually really get on top of this. Because I think the real goal too is that you want farmers to go digital. And I think that's where the opportunity is going to be. So those words, digital, dirty word, digital is a good word. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
The floor is open. I will look here. There are questions on that.
Is there any pizza left? First question.
Okay. Yep. Okay. I wonder if you have any production versus more value or specialty production. It seems like would be implications for the scale of the innovation, the connection to markets, etc.
Exactly. Yeah, good question. Yeah, when you think of it, commodity crop production can treat farmers as basically like serf producers somewhat, because if you can't generate value at the point of production, then the per unit value at the point of production is relatively small. And there you see a lot of the value in digitization anyway, in the commodities, is actually taken by that second class of the integrated supply chain operator. They get the value from that there. They actually want to drive down the price of commodity the most they can, and they're happy to receive product from wherever they can. If you think about high quality or high value production, there's much more scope for value generation around farmers. I mean, I live in Colombia. The only sustainable part of Colombian agriculture is high quality coffee. And it's quite interesting. It's actually a very high skill level needed to produce quality coffee. And incidentally, it was the only area that was never governed by a guerrilla. They always organized themselves because they had very strong social capital. But it's an example of, yes, the higher the value of the product. And in New York, you have certain high value products that are really important, I think. And there you have a strong connection with customer base down the right-hand side of the food system. And you can produce more value by learning what the customer wants and actually learning how to produce it. So yeah, good question, but that's right.
Thank you very much for that. You've mentioned farming systems research. To me, like FSRD, which started in the 70s, late 70s,
Yeah.
you know, these concepts have been around for plus 40 years, right? Verbatim,
Yeah.
what you presented here.
Yeah.
You suggested that one point of failure might have been lack of data to work at that scale. I'm not sure that's the entire explanation. I was just wondering if you had other thoughts.
No, I also mentioned, I don't think they looked at the value proposition idea, and that's a kind of a new concept to try and work out, well, what is the fundamental change that's going to create the value? and how you're actually going to produce that. To actually go through that process, you need to get through to this business model concept that is probably, well, it postdates the earlier farming system research. So from the farming system research stuff that I saw, I thought, well, this is great, but it was always dependent on external money. It was always the projects. And once the project money ran out, then, you know, it was ciao farmers. Nice working with you, but we can't come back here anymore. I thought when I saw that, we have to get beyond that. We have to try and work out a way in which either farmers themselves or suppliers or buyers are actually prepared to subsidize or invest in that process that involves the farmers and is around the farmers. And I don't think we really understood how to do that until we thought about the business model thinking. So yeah, well spotted. and I agree, you know, we thought we were fantastic doing this farm research. And then I came across all this stuff that Larry had done 20, 30 years earlier that we'd talk about the 90s. And also in SEAT, they did a lot of work on that, and they're still trying to do that, but they hadn't got over these two fundamental barriers. One was the data, because without data, you can't, it's got to be cheap data, because you have to have an easy process, a cost-efficient process, if you like, for the farmer to actually provide insight. If you ask farmers to go out and even, you know, measure on yield cuts, often they won't do it. It's too much work, or they just might not have time to do it. So you've got to have easy, cheap data to do it. So in our case, we were using precision ag technology, because every harvester comes with that technology built into it. These days, we're looking at remote sensing to provide a backup for cheap data, so you can guarantee a process can run. But you also need the second part, which is the business model, which actually identifies the value and actually works out how it's all going to work. So thanks, good question.
Just a question, kind of your thoughts in terms of thinking about more developed countries and less developed countries, or often kind of the global north and global south, and the data collection in these different areas. Let's say, thinking like in the U.S. here, we have a really great land grant system and extension system where there is a lot of on-farm research and hopefully unbiased, science-driven on-farm research here. You tend to go to the developed country, there's a lot more on-farm research, but maybe from private companies, right? Like Syngenta, Bayer, and kind of the bias around the data collection in these different areas. I don't know, any thoughts on that? And how that may drive farmer decisions in those areas?
There's a lot of work in Africa around farmer groups, because one of the key things that you need that organization to actually enable the process to run. And so there is a lot of attention to farming groups, and they're very interested in this process as a means of farmers generating their own insight. You need the cheap data. You need that cheap data, and you can get data, but it's not that easy. That's why we're looking at imagery, remote sensing, to actually provide that imagery. The question about how would you trust the results from Bayer, I think. Well, they have the biggest incentive to actually work with farmers, and those that I've spoke to, they're quite keen to do that. Farmers aren't stupid. They're happy to work with Bayer, but there has to be a clear arrangement. It was quite interesting when we were working with a fertilizer company in Australia, and the fertilizer company was rolling out a program of on-farm experimentation with their clients. And I said to the guy who was running it for the fertilizer company, I said, but you realize that farmers might use these results to buy less fertilizer, not more. You realize that. I need to tell you that right now, because they might see that half of their land just isn't responding at all. So they'll buy much less than they did before. His response was really interesting. He said, I don't care. I don't mind that. He said, our main game is to establish trust with the buyer, because we don't want to lose our clients and then have to try and find them again. He said, as far as we're concerned, we're prepared to take a reduction in volume if we have them as a client throughout time. So that sort of really caught my attention, because what that meant was that the trust between the buyer and the seller, or the supplier and the farmer user, at the moment throughout Africa, well, Harold, you know this, is that at the moment, fertilizer is shipped out, shipped into country, distributed, and then from then on, most suppliers have no idea what it does. They don't even know where it went half the time. If we could change that kind of model to one in which the supplier has a much more vested interest to actually enable farmers to use it better through this farmer-centric process, that's what we're aiming for. So yeah, the balance thing, trust thing is a big thing. Very good, good question. Tricky one, but a good one. Yes.
Is it often, are other incentives usually provided to the farmers to participate in the research, or is it usually enough the value that they might get out learning from the experiment?
I think there are cases where that is done, where farmers have to be persuaded. We didn't find that. Virtually every farmer I've spoken to is keen to do it because they like to do it anyway. But remember that you have to be careful about the rules. You can't come in and say, you're going to do this. You have to go in and ask the question, what are you interested in changing? And then when you're designing the experiment, it has to be easy for them to install. So you hear about a lot, or you read a lot of publications talk about some of the on-farm experimentations that we did, but they're too complex to survive outside the research ground. So you have to design it in that way. But I've never found difficulty in getting farmers to trial, providing you do that. It's a good question.
So a couple of days ago, I taught a class for our freshman sustainable agriculture for our first semester freshmen. And about 10 minutes in, it was about digital agriculture. And about 10 minutes in, the students asked a number of very insightful questions, like the one that Debbie just asked about the global south and so on. But there was also a question about, well, what about the public versus the private sector, right? So it's great to do all the on-farm research, right? But ultimately, it needs to, the information that you gather and the knowledge that you develop needs to be delivered on a continuing basis, right? There need to be services provided. It needs to go into a piece of software or equipment or something like that, right? And what is your experience sort of in taking all the knowledge that you gain from this and make it sort of permanent for the farmers? And how do you deliver it? Should it be through the public sector, private sector?
Yeah. Okay, we have three models in our mind. One is the semi-automatic model. You can actually have these OFEs semi-automatic, and there's actually services provided commercially by people in Australia and probably here too, who will put out an experiment for you on your machinery. They will analyze the results, feed you back the results. Very cheap, sort of standard thing. There's hardly been any take-up in that because there's no interpretation of the result. The second model is one where you have a facilitated interpretation of the results to create knowledge. And the knowledge is the more permanent entity in that process. And that's the bit that we're trying to focus on. Knowledge is much more permanent and communicable than just individual results. And individual results, often farmers aren't that keen in those results actually being distributed widely anyway. They're happy to share them within their group. The third type of OFE is actually one which we call a research-based, where you're just looking for that generalizable result that's actually done in field, and that can be distributed much more widely, but the result is more general and less useful to individual farmers. So, Harold, I hope that answers your question, but basically what I'm saying is the knowledge is a much more durable IP and value entity than either individual results, uninterpreted, or in some cases, the research type of result. It's the knowledge and the distribution of the knowledge, which seems to have particular value to farmers. And that can be spread, but partially. The technique can be spread anywhere, but the individual results, you have to be more careful actually distributing those.
This has been a production of Cornell University. On the web at cornell.edu.